Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Nelson Mandela, he is almost universally considered one of the greatest individuals of our time. He was a prisoner of conscience and a living symbol conquering adversity. However, he was far more complex than most mainstream media are willing to admit. Mandela's legacy is so much more than merely being a figure of inspiration and reconciliation. To crosstalk the legacies of Nelson Mandela, I'm joined by my guest, Rajan Menon in New York. He is a professor at the City College of New York and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. In London, we have Jeremy Keenan. He is the author of the upcoming book, Dying for Change, as well as a professorial research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And in Seattle, we cross to Elena Mercer. She is a paleo-libertarian writer and journalist. All right, folks, crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want. Elena, if I can go to you first in Seattle, you got up earliest for this program. I've been watching a lot of the coverage of the death and the funeral and the coverage of this passage of this really, truly great man. And it's basically two words. He's an inspiration, and he was a figure of reconciliation. Is that enough for you?
No, I'm also the author of a book called Into the Cannibals Part, Lessons for America from Post-Apartheid South Africa. And that is definitely not a hagiographic account of Nelson Mandela. I will leave it to your other guests to provide the odes and the hagiographic biographical details of a very genial and impressive man, but certainly his political legacy is not exactly impressive. People often say that he was someone who facilitated the peaceful transition to so-called democracy rule, which is really a dominant party state in South Africa, and any democratic scholar worth his salt will tell you that a dominant party state is not a true democracy. But Nelson Mandela did not require revolution because when he came out of prison, the Anglo-American axis of evil pretty much facilitated everything the ANC negotiated for. So there you had America, which is founded on a decentralized, devolved federal republic, advocating top-down, pure, raw rank democracy. Very little representation of veto power for minorities, no bicameral dispensation, and pretty much very little devolution to the provinces. So that is one of his legacies.
Okay, well, that's one's enough right now. One's enough right now. Okay, Rajan in New York, if I can go to you, what kind of legacy is in your mind when you think of Nelson Mandela? Because I'll show my cards right up front. I mean, I'm a child of the Cold War, and I remember him in the context of the Cold War, South Africa, fighting communism, the global confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, and a great deal of his life before he went to prison was about that. Go ahead, Rajan.
Right. So I appreciate Alana leaving the hagiography to me and Jeremy, but I'm not here to do that. Look, when a man of this stature dies, you will have in the press a great deal of hagiography. And it behooves those of us who pretend to be scholars to look beyond that. So I'm not surprised about the hagiography. Now, Alana mentioned the one-party state that came about as a result of what she called the axis of evil. Well, some historical perspective will tell us that during the era of apartheid,
dominant party state.
Dominant party state, yeah. Let me
not
just
a one-party state, a dominant party state.
If I could just finish.
Okay, Rajan, continue.
Yeah, so you'll have a chance, right?
Continue.
So, a dominant party state. Now, it's passing strange that the same axis of evil had a rather tolerant attitude toward apartheid South Africa during the worst years of apartheid. It is certainly true, and I think Mandela would be the first to admit it, because he was a much more introspective man than some of his admirers who are now trying to lionize him as a man without fault, that he was also facing a formidable structure in the form of apartheid South Africa and the National Party. And so much of what has happened in South Africa, I suspect, was disappointing to Mandela. Does he, in some sense, bear some responsibility for those failures? Absolutely so. I think one of the striking things about Mandela is whether it was as a husband and a father or as a political leader, he was not unaware of his faults, and so he was not a self-hagiographer, if you will.
Okay. Jeremy, one of the things I find interesting in the coverage of Mandela and his death is that there's the culpability of Western countries and apartheid seems to be maybe not whitewashed, but really toned down a lot here. I mean, Western countries, including the United States, supported apartheid almost exactly to the very, very end. And is their support now, the way they adore Mandela, does that absolve them of their sins?
Well, I think you've touched on a very important point there, and that is that the West, particularly the United States and Britain, whether they like to admit it or not, were basically supportive of apartheid. They were supportive of it basically by fighting against those things that might have damaged it or destroyed it, such as sanctions. And if we take both Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, they moved sort of literally heaven and earth to, if you like, destroy the pro-sanctions movement. Bearing in mind that at that time, most blacks in South Africa and all the various surveys that were done, which were difficult to do, but those that were done gave strong indication that the majority of blacks were in favor of sanctions against the apartheid regime, knowing that that was really the one thing, probably the only thing that would make it sit up and pay attention to the rest of the world. And so the pair of them, Thatcher and Reagan, were very strongly supportive, if you like, of the apartheid regime, although they wouldn't say it in so many words. And that is something we must not lose sight of. And of course, with the problem that Mandela had, really, he was, in a sense, between a bit of a rock and a hard place, as we might say. When he was, in a sense, with de Klerk negotiating the transition, he had, I think, very little to work with. In a sense, if a neoliberal agenda had not been put in place, the world would have turned against South Africa, and the markets would have probably pretty well destroyed anything that may have appeared at that moment.
If I can go back to let me go back to Seattle here. That's a very good point, Elena. Mandela was the front man. He was the face to sell this. Go ahead. Jump in.
Can I just object to? I think there's a somewhat of a distortion here about the position of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They believed in constructive engagement, however much this was mocked, a gradual change. Rather than a top-down, instantaneous transformation of majority-minority dispensation. So this was not pro-apartheid. Certainly boycotts were instituted. There's a very valid argument against boycotts in terms of the economy of the country. Boycotts do hurt the poorest, surely. So Mrs. Thatcher was very adamant. I mean, she would have given anyone a handbagging to suggest that you transfer a country as industrialized and developed as South Africa to a bunch of ragtag communists, and that was the ANC in the 1950s. The platform was nationalization and communism.
Okay, all right, Elena, let me jump in here. Let me jump in here, but that didn't happen, and that's a very interesting point. Rajan, if I can go back to you, I mean, how do you think Mandela saw the world in 1990 after 27 years in prison? Because Elena is absolutely correct. When he went to prison, there was a certain worldview. When he came out, what he wanted to do was virtually impossible. That's why I'm going back. He was a perfect front man for this new agenda in South Africa to end apartheid, importantly. Go ahead, Rajan.
Well, my views largely align with Jeremy's, although Elena makes some very, very good points. Look, we all have the luxury of 20/20 hindsight. When Mandela emerged from prison, on the economic side, had he followed the policies of Robert Mugabe or Idi Amin, and there had been massive white flight, as it was, about 750,000 people, very quickly, whites, left South Africa, taking skill and capital with them. He realized that that would have a catastrophic effect on the economy. There were many people who felt that some of his policies were not redistributive enough. But I think you have to walk a fine line between redistributive policies and the need to avoid white flight that would have crippled the economy, but also because I think he believed in a multi-ethnic, multiracial South Africa. On the political front, he's been criticized for the truth and reconciliation process. But I think the alternative might have been a race war, which would have put South Africa in a much, much worse position than it is now. So were these perfect strategies? Can we do what Americans call Monday morning quarterbacking after the fact? Of course, that is true. But I think it behooves us to put historical figures in the context in which we found them. Now, on the question of American constructive engagement...
If I can just jump in...
Sorry?
Can I just jump in here?
Real quickly. Go ahead, real quickly.
Peter, can I just jump in here? Yes, I will. I think that his socialist sympathizers should not begrudge Mandela because he rebranded socialism. He was a very crafty third-way politician. He has followed the neo-Marxist prescription to the T in terms of land distribution, aggressive affirmative action, social racialism, socialized racialism, in which companies have to be co-owned by blacks, but not vice versa. So I think his socialist friends should not be so disappointed in his so-called neoliberal agenda. He did not liberalize the economy. He threatened nationalization repeatedly. So as far as myself am concerned, as a free marketer,
Peter.
I certainly do not think that he was
Okay,
liberalizing
let's go back to
economy.
New York. Right before we go to the break,
Peter,
go ahead. We'll go back to New York. Go
Let
ahead.
me give Jeremy a chance, and I'd like to respond. Yeah?
We've got 10 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, let me give Jeremy a chance. Perhaps he wants to say something.
All right, then we're going to go to a short break here, all right? After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on Nelson Mandela. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the multiple legacies of Nelson Mandela. Okay, Jeremy, I'd like to go back to you in London. In the first part of the program, we actually are talking about, in a sense, is South Africa a better place today than it was before Mr. Mandela was released from prison? And I think we all agree that the end of apartheid is an absolute good, okay? But, you know, there's income inequality, there's poverty. Elena brings up a very good point about pluralism. I mean, what kind of legacy did he leave behind for the average person in South Africa? Jeremy in London, please go.
Well, I was in South Africa last week, and I was trying to answer this very same question. And I think it's very difficult to do in a couple of seconds. But I think there's two statistics that we need to remind ourselves of, which haven't really changed since 1994, that is when democracy began. That is that South Africa has the highest maldistribution of income in the world, or first or second, possibly with Brazil. And secondly, it has the highest expenditure of GDP on private security. Those two facts, if you like, are obviously the two sides of the same coin. Now, at least for the first 10 years of post-apartheid, the argument was, yes, these figures are the legacy of apartheid. Well, those figures are still there. And now that argument no longer washes. We are looking now at the legacy, if you like, of neoliberalism and very strong neoliberal policies within South Africa. Now, Mandela himself may have threatened nationalization of this, that, and the other, but the point is that it never was. It was never put in practice. And the same goes today. And the impression I had last week was very, very interesting. And it was, and I worked there through the 80s, which was the worst time of apartheid. The impression I got last week, talking very much to the youth members of the ANC youth, which goes up to age 35, I should add. So these are mostly 30-year-olds. And even amongst the sort of 30% of the poor dispossessed, there was no mention, no talk, even when I was trying to get it going, of any sort of socialist agenda. All the various strategies and demands and so forth were in the context of a very strong sort of, if you like, right-wing capitalism. And a famous saying at the moment is, we've fought for our freedom, now we're fighting for money. So in a sense, much of I think the legacy of the post-apartheid era is to turn racial capitalism into a class-based capitalism. And that is where I think the fight is now taking place. this. And I must say, I was left with very positive feelings from my talks last week with the ANC youth members and the members of the economic freedom fighters of this legacy, what needs to be done and where it has gone wrong. And I came away, left the country the day before Mandela died, with a very positive feeling for the first time in a long time.
Elena, could it have been very much different? Because part of the negotiating strategy to have Mandela released in the first place, the ANC made this deal, you know, how the economy was going to be run. There wasn't going to be nationalization of the mines, for example, of factories. It was going to be what was the flavor of the time, a neoliberal agenda. And so, again, you know, I'm kind of stressing, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I don't want to be disrespectful to he was the face of the agreement that was made that he had probably very little to do with outside of, you know, I will represent this agenda. Go ahead.
I'm not. Peter, with due respect, I'm not going to have capitalism besmirched. All business, including mines, have to be co-owned by blacks. This is a different form, a mutated form of socialism. It's racialized socialism. In other words, the mines have to take on black, mostly from the elite ANC kleptocracy. They have to take on ownership. So to say that we have rampant capitalism is absolutely untrue. The rate of distribution, the rate of the proportion of taxpayers to tax consumers is 1 to 11 in that country. So you have a very energetic distributionist scheme. And the thing that Nelson Mandela has never mentioned, and I want to mention because we care about human rights and the quality of the individual's right in South Africa, in the new South Africa, is the ethnic decimation of the Afrikaner population, especially the rural community and the farming community. He never raised his voice in protest against these pogroms.
I'm very glad you mentioned that. If we go back to New York, that's a very sensitive issue. I've noticed that Western mainstream media absolutely doesn't want to talk about that, but that is an issue in post-apartheid Africa, South Africa.
Let's talk about distribution and redistribution. In apartheid South Africa, there was also a highly distributionist system. The whites controlled most of the economy and the blacks were denied political rights. Now let's not fight the legacy about why this was and so on and so forth. When Mandela came to power, and I agree with Peter, I mean, calling him some sort of radical redistributionist is simply flies in the face of the facts. But let's assume that some redistribution was done. And I think Peter is on point when he says not enough was done. Given the legacy of apartheid, where blacks were systematically frozen out of political and economic rights and denied the basic tools that are required to thrive in any kind of system, be it socialist or capitalist, something needed to be done. I think, all things considered, the criticism of Mandela on the part of many disenfranchised South Africans is that a lot of the problems that Jeremy was talking about have not gone away. Income inequality has increased. Racial segregation is not the law now, but it is de facto present. Elena mentioned corruption. She called it a kleptocracy. I'll stay away from labels and names, but there is a huge amount of corruption. And would Mandela deny this? I rather suspect that he would not. But what I take issue with is this notion that he was some kind of a rabid socialist who wanted to topsy-turvy turn everything around. Were that the case, we would see very different statistics in South Africa today. Who controls still most of the wealth in South Africa if the redistribution has been so strong? And what is wrong with requiring that people who have been disenfranchised be given a seat at the table?
Okay,
Governments do
I want to
this
change.
all
We're
the
running
time.
quickly, run out of time, and I want to change gears a little bit here. Jeremy, if I can go to you.
Is that a seat?
Please, we have to keep moving on. Jeremy in London, if I can go to you. Three of Mandela's best friends were Castro, Gaddafi, and Arafat. Again, you know, Western perceptions here. I'm sure that's not being focused very much on CNN and BBC. You know, because he's supposed to be with the Spice Girls, and he's supposed to be with rock stars, with those wonderful shirts that he was wearing, which were wonderful. But this is, again, this kind of spinning Mandela to the way we want to see him. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, I think I'll just go back to a point I'd like to make here. We've been talking mostly about the economy and the redistribution and so on and so forth, and not a huge amount has changed there at the macro level. I think when it comes to Mandela, I really don't think Mandela himself had a great deal to do with economic policy in the period when he was president. He was much more concerned with what I think he would regard as sort of higher things, and that is basically trying to stave off the violence that I think almost everybody thought would be characteristic of whatever sort of transition took place in South Africa. And I think, without sort of being hagiographic, I think his great legacy is not so much on the economy, because, as we've been saying, there's still a lot to be desired there, and in some respects it's even got worse. But at the end of the 1980s, when apartheid was at its very worst, I was working there then. I think very, very few people ever thought there could be a peaceful transition. And I think what he has done, and at the expense of the economy perhaps, was that he has brought about a degree of reconciliation where I think now the idea, the sense of a sort of a race war is really highly unlikely. And I think that is his great contribution to South Africa. Not so much on the economic front, but I don't think he had a great deal to do with the economy to give him, if you like, the justice for that. Other people were there, and it said, yes, he was, if you like, suckered into a sort of neoliberal agenda, but I think he was happy to be suckered into anything, if you like, on the economic front, as long as he could bring about the reconciliation that has actually happened, and I think that is his great legacy.
Okay,
on the
Lennon, let me go back to Lennon in
home.
Seattle here, because I think it's very interesting. As in, if he wasn't given much control over the economy, which I think is very likely here, he actually had other things to do, and that's foreign policy as well. I mean, he was very, very much against the intervention, the illegal intervention into Iraq, for example, a strong supporter of Palestinian rights. Castro was one of his best living friends.
Pot kettle black.
Go ahead, Len, jump in.
Although pot kettle black, because he did invade Lesotho in 1998 after he criticized Bush. Of course, I agree with Nelson Mandela's pronouncements on Washington's foreign policy, but one thing about Nelson Mandela as a capitalist, that is an absolute joke. He repeatedly repeated the mantra that capitalism was the instrument of white oppression, when I think the history of labor in South Africa shows that capitalists acting in self-interest, especially in the strike of 1922, insisted on employing black laborers because they were as productive as white laborers and cheaper. So capitalists have always tried to circumvent and bypass apartheid laws because,
that was in their interest. We're almost out of time. I want to give Rajan the last word in New York here. What is history going to say about this man 100 years from now? Look into your crystal ball.
Well, first of all, nobody has called Nelson Mandela a capitalist, but let me answer your question. I think he'll be seen as a mixed leader. I think a person who himself recognized his personal and political foibles. But to come back to a point that Jeremy made, what strikes me is that had Mandela not steered the transition in the way that he did and embraced reconciliation, things could have turned out to be far, far worse politically.
Okay,
Violence,
on that very positive note, we've run out of time, folks. Many thanks to my guests today in New York, in London, and in Seattle. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.